Okay, so first of all, if anybody wants to tweet, that's fine. As some of you may recall, a couple of years ago in York, I gave a conference presentation which, just for interest's sake, involved the insertion of 13 Deep Purple song titles as a reference for dating the early Jurassic and the Lufeng Formation. As we're in Birmingham, I thought we'd try something similar, and so we're going to see how that works out, and you can claim your prize at the end if you win. So, this is what we're going to be talking about today. Pachycormids, surprise, surprise. They're generally kind of dull, miscellaneous group of bony fishes, maybe half a meter to a meter long. Wish I'd had a chance to look at my talk. But there are also these much larger animals. And what you find is that because there is a decline in preservation, so the larger the adult size, the less of the axial skeleton is preserved. We tend to rely on these wonderful 3D reconstructions largely by Bob Nichols, because the actual bony skeletons look far, far less impressive. So, try and give my voice a small break before the next slide. A lot of this started quite recently. We have the Jurassic one on the right, but the other one was this specimen on the left here, which was going under the name of Ichthypriapus, and it was listed under Protosphaerina. And I remember Matt Friedman coming up to me and saying, "Jeff, we really got to take this. I mean, we've got to kill the name Ichthypriapus." And I said, "What? It means fish stick, doesn't it?" He said, "Yeah, it means fish stick." So we had Project Fish Stick. We must kill the name Ichthypriapus. So we ended up with Boner Ichthyes. I'm not really sure that was much of an improvement. But anyway, so this is where it all starts. This is like the cradle, if you like, of the Pachycormids. Way up in Holzmaden, this very small area here. And of course, if you're a good paleobiographer like Bell, you say, "There must be more than this provincial life." And you'd be absolutely right, because, of course, in the middle to late Jurassic, you get wide-scale development of the rifting that you have here. You have this what looked like an ordinary world. It's planet Earth, but actually, of course, it's way back in the early Toarcian as we start off on the left. And then over here, as you see the splitting of the continents, this rather large river here, which is like a Rio Grande, if you like, that it's splitting across. And then the more that this divides up, the more dissemination, until basically you get, by the end of Cretaceous, the Pachycormids have become this global brand, like a virus. But one thing that's quite interesting is we have a 35 million year gap. This is not in the suspension-feeding pachycormids, which are continuously represented, but in the tusked or more carnivorous pachycormids, which is perhaps quite surprising. So this comes out of some work I've been doing with TJ Maltese. This is the most complete specimen of Protosphaerina that's ever been found. It is, normally you just find all these little bits of pectoral fins. And also some work I was doing last year on Leedsichthys at Peterborough. Go to www.bigjurassicfish.com, you know you want to. And that features some work on the fish that I dug up seasons 2002, 2003. And what Anthony and I did was we looked at some of the pectoral fin morphology. It's a traditional thing you see in pachycormids, this idea of a scythe-like fin. And you can look at a thing like this and say, well, yeah, it's like a scythe, but if an animal like this, is that really like a scythe-like pectoral fin? Is that like a scythe-like pectoral fin? Is that like a scythe-like pectoral fin? Could you bring in your harvest with that? I suspect not. And so what we did was we tabulated over 100 pachycormid specimens, and we found a quite pleasant surprise that there were 3 Morpho Types present, and they broke out quite nicely. You have type 1, which is the first one, sort of aspect ratio 3:4. It features this little attachment part of the fin to the body. And then you have type 2, so the gladiform, and that's a slightly higher aspect ratio, 4:5. All the suspension feeders have this form of pectoral fin. Then you have type 3, aspect ratio way up to 13:15, These are the pursuit predators, things very much like Protosphaerina. So we get a nice sort of split like this, and we get a nice 1980s reference. We got two tribes. And what we find is that the tusked ones come into this nice cluster here, and the suspension feeders here. The suspension feeders type 2 fins, remember, the tusked ones type 3. And that's all very well. But we did a presentation last year where we looked at the radials and the scapulocoracoids of both Protosphaerina and Bonarichthyes. Remember, Bonarichthyes and Protosphaerina, they're the apex Cretaceous suspension feeder and pursuit predator, if you will. They should be two very, very divergent parts of the tree, and yet we were finding a rather unexpected level of conservatism. And thankfully, we had the prescience to actually put this in our conclusions, that despite the extremes of fin shape reflecting diversity of lifestyle, there was surprising convergence. And this was slightly unnerving. I mean, was there something we were missing? Is there something I should know? And what we found with closer analysis was we went back to this and we looked at Leedsichthys, Bonarichthyes, and some of the other Pachycormids to see if there was something that we were missing. So we find pelvic fin form 1 appears in the Pachycormid. And basically, it's just a little triangular thing about halfway down the body. But there's a second form of pelvic fin form in Pachycormids. You get these really long ones underneath the oxters, as my people will call it, of pectoral fins, of Bonarichthyes. And also we now know, because of the work I was doing last year, that the long pectoral fins, the long pelvic fins under the pectorals are actually present in Leedsichthys as well. And surprise, surprise, they're also present in Protosphaerina. You get these long pelvic streamer fins. It's got the wrong type of pelvic fin. It's got like a suspension feeding equivalent. So that looks a little bit weird. We went back and looked at the pectoral fins again of Protosphaerina, and we looked at some of the other ones. So we look at here, this is Soros Thomas. It's one of the early Tuarcian Pachycormids, a type 1. But if you look closely at it, all of the fin rays, or 90% plus, terminate on the trailing edge of the pectoral fin. Okay, so that's quite straightforward. Trouble is, if you look at Bonarichthyes, the fin rays are terminating on the leading edge of the pectoral fin. And you get this on another animal, Protosphaerina. So Protosphaerina, again, is exhibiting a pattern which is more consistent with the apex Cretaceous suspension feeders than with the earlier carnivorous ones. So that's a little bit surprising. Final one is the Gill Raker form. Yeah, I'm giving a talk. I've got to talk Gill Rakers. So this is Leedsichthys, these long elongate Gill Rakers. And just a little heads up, we're finding a similar form coming out of Solnhofen, except for scale, it's a lot bigger. So watch this space. But there's also a second type of Gill Raker form that you get across Pachycormids. And it's these little short denticulate ones. You see it in Asthenocormus, one of the suspension feeders from the Tithonian. You also see something very, very similar from Protosphaerina. And again, that seems wrong. So you start looking at this and you think, well, we've got our nice big tusk group and we've got our suspension feeding group. But if you roughly code these things, so this is like the green is the pelvic fin form, the blue is which side the rays terminate on, and the red is the Gill Raker form. Then one of these things is different. One of these things is not the same. And this one looks far more like it should be in this group. So it seemed our tusked radar is broken, and maybe there's some other signal that we're actually missing here. So that was a Gestalt thing. Gestalt, of course, means I don't want to do cladistics. So still trying to put it off a little bit longer, I use this new software program called Felt Tip Pen. And I went through Friedman et al.'s character matrix for 2010. So it's 93 characters. And I compare Protosphaerina with Bonarichthyes, and you find that there's actually only 3 characters in conflict between the two. And also, there's only 3 characters connecting Orthocormus, which is the oldest of the carnivore types in the Jurassic, before Protosphorina. So actually, there's almost as much of an argument that Protosphorina could be one side or the other, but it also has two distinct suspension-feeding pachycormid characters. That's a skull boss position and an unsegmented caudal fin. So, do we have too much of a cranial emphasis in the data set? 2010 data set, more than 77% of the 2011 version expanded are cranial, which is unusually high quantity. So these things have been added to, another couple of characters, a couple of taxa. And what I wondered was maybe, is there too much of a dental dependency here? We're getting 10 characters, all to do with teeth in this. So let's try some tooth extraction. So here's the regular data set, 132 characters. Yeah, we got our two tribes coming out quite nicely. And then we take, then when it really starts to come undone, is when you take the 10 tooth characters out, and Protosphorina jumps straight into the heart of the suspension feeding group. And you do a strict cretensis tree. It's still very comfortably in that. Your tusk group collapses completely into a pinnate polytomous or polytomous hell. And just for completeness, this majority rule is still showing the same pattern present. So consider us surprised. I mean, that's pretty wild, boys. So this is a problem bug report for Cladis of Graham Lloyd's in the audience. The latest iteration that came out a couple of weeks ago, it scrunches up the ages all wrong. So if you can work on that. Otherwise, people can use CorelDRAW like we did. So this is where the new version of the data set comes out. This is the 35 million year gap that I talked about earlier for the Cretaceous versions. And maybe the reason there's a 35 million year gap is because we're looking for something between Orthocormus there and Protosphorina, but actually Protosphorina was coming off from within the suspension feeders. So these things possibly are secondarily carnivorous. So Rob Sansom unexpectedly gets a plug in one of my talks because he recently made a similar point regarding dental data in something called mammals. So what I wanted to do with this one is just suggest, because basically we don't have any final answers. It's just interesting that if you do take the teeth out, then actually there's a stronger grouping with overall characters in a lot of parts of the body for something like Protosphorina to be with the suspension feeders. And maybe this is a result of placing too much emphasis on the facial characters, which is what a lot of us do. So maybe what Protosphorina was actually doing was taking toothiness back and making it its own, or as somebody said, or as Anthony said in one of our earlier drafts, maybe this is an example of faster vegetarian kill, where the suspension feeders say, oh no, I fancy a bit of a steak, as people used to tell me when I became vegetarian. Our first model for this pattern in terms of the facial characters having too much emphasis was a more obvious one. We were looking at aliens, and we thought, well, it's a bit like, you know, people just see the xenomorph, say, oh, I'm going to score all the characters in the xenomorph. No, it's nothing like the human being that's behind it. But actually, since then, there's perhaps been a better metaphor that's come up. And so, as well as in EAVP, we did a more direct title, where we did alien facehuggers on Mesozoic suspension feeding fish. I perhaps like to say that the final conclusion, don't judge too much by appearances. The cranial characters may be the most obvious, but they might tell less of the story that you think. And if you look closer, the appearance may start to unravel or fray, leaving the differences to be quite undeniably stark. Thank you very much for your time.